Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us. My name is Kristina Kausch. I'm the Deputy Managing Director of GMF South and Wider Europe. Um, Over the past 3 weeks, we have seen protests in Iran spread again, yet the scale and intensity of those protests seem different this time. The state has responded with a particularly harsh crackdown this time. Reportedly, thousands have been killed. And the question is now whether this is another cycle the system can absorb or whether it's something more consequential. At the same time, the external picture has sharpened too. We have heard President Trump floating publicly a range of options, including military ones, and all that is happening in a broader context where U.S. foreign policy seems to most of us more and more volatile and unpredictable. So to understand what is actually in play, we're going to do this in two parts. First, we'll look at what has happened inside Iran, in Washington, and across the region, and how those pieces interact. And then we'll turn to what comes next. How stable is the situation? What options does the US have? And what all of this tells us about the current direction and strategy of US foreign policy. Now, before we do that, let me turn to a few housekeeping rules. First of all, thank you all for joining us here. While we are having this conversation, I would kindly ask all of you who are joining us online here to use the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions to the speakers whenever you like. And a little further down the road, we are going to take those questions and pitch them to the speakers. Secondly, oh yes, the session is being recorded, so recording of it will be eventually be made available on GMF's YouTube channel. And before we dive in the discussion, let me introduce our speakers. I am very, very grateful to the four of you for being here. We have Aziz Alghashian, who is Senior Research Fellow and Director of Research at the Observer Research Foundation, Middle East, and also an Associate Fellow with CARPO. Aziz, welcome. Mohammad Shabani is the editor of Amwaj.media, which is a London-based news site covering Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. Mohammad, welcome. Ali Vaez is the International Crisis Group's Iran Project Director and also the Senior Advisor to the President. Ali, thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Grace Wermenbol is an incoming Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, but Grace also served in high-level national security and foreign policy roles across the US government until very recently, including as a Middle East specialist at the State Department and Middle East Director at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Thank you for being here, Grace. Thank you all. So without any further ado, let's turn to a little bit of a readout of what happened in the past few weeks. Maybe, Ali, I can start with you. What can you give us a little bit of a roundup of, I know this is tough to do in just a few words, but what happened in the past few weeks that brought us to this point, which for many is being characterized as a tipping point in the situation in Iran? What happened and how can we interpret it?
Thank you very much, Kristina, for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor to be on the panel with my colleagues. Look, the reality is that I think these protests could be divided into two phases. The first phase was triggered by a sharp drop in the value of the Iranian rial, which created a lot of concerns in the bazaar and the traditional market in Tehran. And we saw shopkeepers walking out and protesting. It did start a tsunami of similar protests throughout the country, from smaller towns and cities to larger ones. But the numbers were quite limited in the early stages. And the government seems to opt for persuasion rather than pressure in responding to it. The President Pezeshkian, offered dialogue and started doing some reforms like the paying direct subsidies to the population and changing the head of the central bank. But all of that was too little, too late, and protests were snowballing. And by the second week, we had tens of thousands of people in the streets. And then there was this call for mass mobilization over the weekend of January 6, 7, and 8. When we don't know the exact numbers, but it appears that much larger crowds came to the streets. Part of that invitation happened, was offered basically by the former Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. And we know that by that point, the regime decided to bring down its iron fist. The speed and ferocity with which it brought down the iron fist is really shocking. We've had a long history of protests in Iran. There have always been fatalities and casualties and people who've been imprisoned. But the scale and scope this time around is just purely shocking. The numbers are in the thousands of fatalities. Compare that to the Women Life Freedom Movement in 2022, when we had 500 fatalities, or in the Green Movement, there were about 80. So this is an order of magnitude more disastrous than anything else that we have seen before. Now, the regime is blaming that on foreign instigation and terrorists who were on the ground shooting at security forces, and basically resulted in mayhem. Although I can't rule out the possibility of Iran's regional adversaries trying to pour fuel on fires, but it is really also hard to imagine that this is the full picture. I think the failure is primarily the regime's. It has failed to change its ways. It has failed to address the underlying grievances of the population, and it has driven the society to a point of explosion. And as a result of it, obviously, people desperate and angry come to the streets, and protests are becoming more frequent and more violent in Iran. None of that requires your enemies to do anything. If the adversaries interfere, is because the context for it already exists. So I think the crime is already committed by the regime, and the blame is also primarily on the regime rather than anyone else. So for now, it does appear that violence and brutality that has been deployed has resulted in this round of protests being crushed. But as I said, because the regime is not able to address any of these problems, it is only buying time until the next round of confrontation between the state and the society.
Thank you, Ali. Mohammad, picking up there, how do these protests, well, Ali has in part already alluded to it. What do you think, how these protests compare to previous cycles, and why did they take on this momentum now and not in previous rounds?
Thank you, Kristina, for inviting me to your timely event and to join your distinguished panel. I agree with basically everything Ali said. I think there's no major contradiction in what I have to say versus his remarks. What I would point out is that if you're going to do a comparative approach and fundamentally look at how does this round of unrest differ compared to the past? If you look at 2019, for instance, when I think it was the first time we saw a real surge in the number of deaths. That was the first kind of shock. And that was when the Rouhani administration increased fuel prices overnight. And it ignited very violent confrontations, and not just in Tehran, outside Tehran as well. It was nationwide. And then you saw death toll of, I think, between 300 up to 1,500, depending on the sources. And at that point, the government had tools at its disposal to address a grievance, right? So let's say if there's a fuel price hike, then you can, well, address fuel prices, you can address subsidies, you can take measures to support or to address whatever grievance there is. In 2022, you had the Women Life Freedom protests, which were ignited by the death in morality police custody of a young woman in Tehran. And it was centered around the mandatory hijab, the Islamic headscarf and the veiling, etc. And then again, the government had tools to address that grievance, and we saw the implementation of that kind of tool, particularly after the June war with Israel, which is that the government, in effect, at least in Tehran and in many other cities, gave up on the morality police patrols. They're gone. They stopped arresting women for poor veiling. So we saw again that there is a kind of lever for the state to address some kind of grievance. I think what Ali is alluding to is that in this round it's very hard to see the state having any lever to fundamentally address the underlying economic grievances. And while I agree with that, the context for foreign intervention or interference, or however you want to put it, is absolutely a direct result of the policies of the Islamic Republic. It's also important to grasp that this context is very much shaped by external sanctions. We saw the Treasury Secretary Besant just yesterday openly, explicitly say basically that we see sanctions as working, and one parameter for, quote, working is causing unrest. So they're openly saying that we want to instigate policy change by having pressure from below, forcing the authorities to change tack and change their policy. So it's pretty straightforward. And unless the Islamic Republic fundamentally has some kind of shift or embraces some kind of shift in its foreign policy, it's hard to see that local context change because, again, it doesn't have presently the tools to address grievances like it did in 2019 or 2022 with the Women Life Freedom protests. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. And what I take away from both of your contributions here is that this is a cycle that is likely to repeat itself until there's some sort of solution, right? And the question of sanctions leads me up to the role of the United States and what we have observed, or I would say the guesswork that we've done over the past few weeks. Grace, maybe I can turn to you. How do you interpret the Trump administration's response so far, which has been the utterings of President Trump on this file have been pretty volatile, contradictory at times. What do you make of it? What development, if anything, have you seen, and what's your interpretation of it? I guess none of us can really know, but how would you evaluate the past few weeks in U.S. foreign policy over Iran?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for having me as well. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. In terms of the U.S. response and specifically how Trump has responded to the latest protests, I think it's fairly clear that he's very much tried to present himself as somewhat of a humanitarian interventionist on the part of the Iranian protesters, as almost kind of a defender and supporter of the Iranian protest movement. And as you mentioned or alluded to, this is very clear in kind of the public statements he made. As protests expanded in early January, he declared that the U.S. Was quote unquote locked and loaded, warning the regime of intervention if it would move to killing protesters. On January 9th, he declared that the regime had crossed a red line. And on January 13th, he indicated that help was on the way, which many people thought meant that U.S. military actions were imminent. For now, it appears that imminent military action is not necessarily on the table, though I think it is possible that the threat of force is still there in the near and longer term. In terms of why the attacks did not come about that were heavily anticipated last week, Trump said, he said a bunch of things, but he said that part of the reason was that had to do with Iran's decision to not follow through on the execution of protesters. With that being said, there's also reports that regional allies and specifically the Gulf countries and Israel had warned against strikes, in part over concerns over the US's ability to actually defend against an Iranian retaliation. And that itself had to do with the fact that U.S. assets had moved out of the Middle East region in recent months, including assault ships, which had been moved to the Caribbean and other parts of the world. And I will add here to kind of get back to my point of why I would not take a near-term attack off the table is that there are reports that the U.S. is currently rebuilding its military assets and equipment in the region. If we can just zone out for a second and then we can maybe focus on other things. It's in terms of the broader policy context, I think it's very clear that Trump feels heavily emboldened by some of his recent foreign policy moves in places like Venezuela, but even in Iran. He has spoken very highly of what he deems to be a minimally invasive and very effective military strikes on Iran. And I do think that as a result of that, as a result of this kind of adventurism, he feels more emboldened to undertake renewed military strikes. In terms of the domestic context, I think, Trump has also felt fairly emboldened to use the military for domestic policy purposes. But I will note that from a domestic point of view, military interventionism, and particularly in Iran, is not heavily supported. As you know, Trump came into office in 2016 and in 2020, riding on an agenda of the forever wars or the internal wars being over. And I think across the board, that is fairly popular in the U.S. The question really remains to what extent Trump is led by these kind of domestic trends in his foreign policy decisions, or whether his advisors are able to kind of challenge him on his own decisions, even when those go against potentially his electoral desires in future months.
Yeah, thank you. Grace, let me follow up with a question here. Well, the quotes you mentioned from Trump really reflect that he has leaned himself forward with a number of formulations that remind me a little bit about the Obama red line rhetoric, and that one that I think Trump might regret later on because they suggested that he has drawn a red line, which he maybe didn't mean to. So, and I'm guessing that he would want to avoid any kind of impression in this direction. So maybe you could comment on that. And also, what internal debates are, now, if we go beyond Trump as a person and his immediate entourage, what internal debates are likely taking place between the White House, the State Department, Pentagon, intelligence community, maybe in Congress? What other relevant voices are there in the United States, and how have they been commenting on this situation?
Yeah, no, it's thank you for the follow-up question. In terms of comparisons to the Obama red line, I don't think necessarily Trump feels necessarily required to stick to what he says. I mean, I think if you just look at the last year, the amount of times he has made proclamations and backed out. I mean, even in Greenland yesterday, over Greenland and Davos, he has, warned of taking Greenland by force, but now that is no longer the case. I think what Trump likes to do, and you see this across the board in his foreign policy decision-making and moves, is that he finds a way to sell something as a win, whether that meets the initial kind of stated objective or not. So I think that'll be the case in Iran as well. In terms of kind of the other voices across the U.S., again, I think the bigger picture here is relevant. I don't think at present Congress has taken the necessary or the kind of the desired by some moves to actually curb Trump's adventurism abroad. As I mentioned, I think when Trump came into office, he did represent kind of a broad spectrum across American society, and particularly among Republicans, that brought together neo-isolationists and people who believe that, essentially that Americans' forever wars and interventionism abroad was not in the U.S.'s favor. But broadly, you see that even if those debates still happen, and if there are still important figures who represent that hasn't really curbed the president's own foreign policy decision to date.
Yeah. Aziz, before I come to you, actually, I'd like to remind our participants here online, if you'd have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll come to them later. So that is offered anytime you like. Aziz, Grace mentioned the role of regional actors, and that one thing that we've seen commented on, that's a possibility that countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others might have had an influence on Trump's apparent backing out last week. Perhaps you could comment on that. What do you know? And how is this situation being seen from Saudi Arabia in general?
Well, firstly, Kristina, thank you very much for having me, and it's good to join everybody on the panel. Um, I, I mean, I very much agree with what Grace said, and I'd like to expand upon it regarding what is happening or what is coming out from the Gulf, and also uh, regarding Israel. I think both have discouraged any kind of American uh, action, military action, but for different reasons. I'll start off from the Gulf perspective, in my opinion. And I think, yes, indeed, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman were the ones that sort of discouraged any kind of military strikes because I think this very much goes against their own security. And I think this is very much this is clear. Here, I think it's important to also contextualize uh, a little bit more this crisis in Iran within what Saudi sees and what Saudi in particularly, but the region also the Gulf sees in the region. Uh, there's a lot of fires happening at the same time. I mean, also, this cannot be separated from other fires going on. We just have a Saudi UAE spat in Yemen. Syria is still very unstable. The situation in Gaza is very precarious. The situation in Sudan. So there's a great deal of uh, not only instability, but a great deal of tension in the region. And therefore, I think the last thing that the Saudis and the GCC states want is more instability across the Gulf, especially in Iran, that they see is a core to their, or maintaining relations with Iran as a core of their own security as well. This is, in my opinion, I think, pretty important and pretty pertinent. Um, for a long time, I think for a long time there's been the speculation that the Saudis have been very keen on trying to see kind of a regime change, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the past few months after the Saudi-Iran normalization in 2023 illustrated the fact that the Saudis are really investing a great deal in this rapprochement. And therefore, in my opinion, I don't see the Saudis wanting to have a regime change. And therefore, they're invested in some sort of stability. Moreover, I think it's important to also contextualize what's happening within the Gulf, which is a great deal of reform and projects and a restructuring of their own economy. And therefore, the restructuring of their own economy necessitates a stable region. So for me, a discouragement of Trump attacking Iran is of the essence. Why? I think because they believe a strike on Iran, an American strike on Iran, is a short-term measure, and then the region will be inherited with a long-term ramifications. And this is what I think they're trying to avoid as much as they can. And this is, I think, this is where they have issues with American interventionism like this. So that's what they're trying to avoid. They're trying to maintain that security. They're trying to maintain that rapprochement, that a great deal of it is actually psychological. You know, the fact that they're trying to speak to Iran and change the discourse towards Iran, even throughout the Gaza war, they're, you know, making sure that, listen, we're not against you. We're not really, you know, we're not allowing our airspace or the American forces in our based in the GCC to be against you, and time and again. And I think it has worked. Now, unfortunately, one thing that hasn't worked was the fact that Iran does retaliate. Um, Now, it won't retaliate. I think they proved it that they won't retaliate when it comes to, for example, Israel striking Iran. But I think they will retaliate when it comes to an American attack. So this is one thing. The other thing I would say that Israel is discouraging an attack because for different reasons. And I think it's important to note that there are elections on the horizon, and that basically both Mohammad and Ali could speak to this far more than I can. But I think the strikes and the 12-day war in the summer created a rally around the flag um, situation, which I think, in my opinion, was at times used by some people within inside Israel to say, listen, Netanyahu, what you're doing is actually not creating a regime change. It's actually something that's working the other way around. So, in my opinion, I think this is why the region is not calling for more action. They're calling for more de-escalation. They just see someone that's coming in trying to create legacies, trying to create foreign policy legacies at their behalf. And this is why I think there's a great deal of discouragement. The last point I will say is this. Um, I think what the GCC wants from Iran is not at this moment a change of the regime. It's a change within the regime. And it's a way of how they would approach, I think, the Saudis. I think they would approach Oman and Qatar. And I think this is, a change within the regime and how they would approach and how they would view, the other side of the Gulf. And that's, I think, at that moment. Right now, calling for, regime change is a very distant reality. And you can see this even from Adil Jubair last week when he was asked, listen, what do you think about what's happening in Iran? He said, listen, you know, this is an Iran issue and we're not going to intervene. So clearly they're maintaining a clear distance. They want to see stability. There's still a great deal of outstanding grievances, but the way they're doing it is not through being opportunistic with short-term measures. I think they're looking and they're playing the long game.
Okay. It strikes me there's clearly no appetite for further destabilization in the region. You say it strikes me that most of the times the term regime change is mentioned. The content is referring to the point up to the regime change, but dedicating much less time on regime change towards what kind of regime or subsequent governance arrangement. I'd like to turn to the future, or Ali, maybe I can trouble you to tell us a little bit, what would you say, in your view, are the most likely, very roughly likely scenarios for the next weeks and months? What are the main options that we could conceive, knowing what we know today?
Sure. I'll look into the crystal ball and share some ideas with you. Look, I think in the short run, I agree with Grace that we're not out of the woods, in the sense that if the president couldn't deliver on the threat that he put on the table in early January, by the end of this week, he will actually be in a much better position to deliver on that threat. USS Lincoln will arrive in the Arabian Sea, I think, in the next 2-3 days. And with it, the US would have tremendous firepower, both in order to sustain a campaign against Iran and also to defend its own assets in the region and defend Israel. And it is quite possible that protests in Iran would reemerge, not in a few months, but maybe even in a few weeks. There was this tradition that in the run-up to the 1979 revolution, a 40-day memorial cycle for people who died in protests as a Shia tradition, that every time that there were protests, people were killed by the Shah's regime, then their memorials 40 days later resulted in additional people being killed, and this cycle led to a cascading of events that resulted in the toppling of the Shah regime a year later. We might see a reemergence of protest even in a few weeks, and at that point, the U.S. would be militarily prepared to deliver. And although I also agree with the assessment that the laws of political gravity usually do not apply to President Trump, but I also believe that he's encircled by people who are putting a lot of pressure on him to finish the job of a regime that is broadly seen in Washington as being on the ropes. However, having said this, the reality, Kristina, is that the US also doesn't have really any good military options to deal with this problem. If it goes for political decapitation, whether it's the supreme leader or additional top brass of the Revolutionary Guards, you might still end up with a Venezuela type of situation. This is a regime that is very well entrenched and also deeply benched. So you might just get more hardline elements from the Revolutionary Guards replacing the current leadership, and that's not going to necessarily result in less repression at home or less aggression abroad. So that I don't think is even beyond the theatrics of it would have much of an impact. And also, if he is to go after the IRGC's repressive capabilities, command and control, it really doesn't make sense to go in and not to target ballistic missile sites, because that is what Israel is now primarily concerned about. That is what Prime Minister Netanyahu had a conversation with President Trump towards the end of the year, sharing his concerns that at some point Iran's conventional capacity could kind of match the amount of damage it could have with unconventional capacity in a small country like Israel. In that scenario, we'll end up with a serious kinetic option, which is going to result in Iran facing an existential threat and being cornered, lashing out with everything it has, as they have threatened to do. This is, I think, what really concerned the countries in the region, because they took that threat of Iranian disproportionate retaliation, not something in line with what it has done in the past, performative strikes against US bases in Iraq or in Qatar, or even targeting energy infrastructure in the region in a way that it really didn't result in any fatalities. Those kind of things, I think, clearly have demonstrated that they do not produce the intended deterrent result that Iran wanted. So it has to go big or go home, basically. That's the conclusion on the Iranian side, and this is why regional countries are concerned. Now, if this doesn't happen in the next few weeks and the trigger is not protest, I'm afraid that by this spring, we would still be in a very similar situation, because Israel would see a window before we get closer to Israeli elections and before we get closer to midterm elections in the US to try to, again, address this question of ballistic missiles, and try to even push the regime over the edge, because it believes that the regime is on the brink right now. And this is, I agree 100% with Aziz, this is the difference between Israel and the Gulf countries. I would argue, maybe slightly differently from Aziz, that I would say Gulf countries are fine with containment of Iran. Containment of Iran is no longer sufficient for Israel. Israel wants regime collapse. And regime collapse in a way that it results in Iran becoming another failed state in the region, internally focused, is totally fine for Israel. It's a problem for countries in the region who would then have to deal with waves of refugees and radicalization and instability spilling over their borders. And also the US would have to deal with those consequences as well. But Israel, I think, would be fine with a scenario like that. Now, I kind of painted the very negative scenarios. One cannot put past President Trump the possibility of diplomatic engagement as well. But I am now much more cynical about that. That was the case a few weeks ago. This is a regime that was already, in terms of legitimacy at home, in a very bad place. It is now a regime that has committed a massacre. And again, as much as President Trump is not concerned about domestic political backlash in the US, I still find it very difficult to grant any kind of economic reprieve that would be seen as throwing a lifeline to a regime on the ropes. In Washington, that would be very hard to swallow. So I'm cynical about it. And even on the Iranian side, if they are to now make concessions to Trump that they were reluctant to make a few weeks ago, right before he threatened to intervene in their internal affairs, it would be seen obviously as a sign of weakness, which is something that they've always been very reluctant to do. So I'm cynical about it, but again, I can't rule it out as a possibility either.
Yeah, thank you. And so maybe throw this very same questions to the rest of the panel also, if any of you would like to chip in on that question. What are the most likely developments that you see in the coming weeks? And in particular, maybe how do we interpret the US troop deployments into the region in the light of what you just said, Ali, that essentially regime change by military intervention is not actually a realistic option. So what's the point? Would anybody like to venture on anything, on the crystal ball question, or otherwise we'll turn to one more question before we'll turn to the questions in the Q&A.
I'm happy
Anyone?
to.
Yeah, please.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's Aziz. I jumped ahead of you. No, I'll just follow up on some of the things that Ali mentioned, and what I also kind of alluded to in my opening remarks. For now, it doesn't appear that an attack is imminent, but because of the redeployment and the buildup of military assets, it's something that I don't think should be taken off the table. But I do think there's an important distinction to be made here when we're thinking about future attacks, potentially by the US. And they don't necessarily need to just be focused on the latest protests. And this is something I think Ali also alluded to back in December when Trump and Netanyahu met. It was made clear that Trump essentially gave Netanyahu the green light by saying he would back renewed Israeli strikes if it became clear that Iran was rebuilding its nuclear facilities and its ballistic missile capability. Now, I think given what we know of the aftermath and the efficacy of the June strikes, it is highly unclear to what extent Iran's nuclear facilities to what extent they actually were destroyed. And there's also huge question marks on the enriched uranium that was moved prior to the strikes. So the point is, potential future strikes do not need to just be focused on the current protests. There are, of course, not just military strike options when you think of kind of policy decisions. There's also non-kinetic actions. We mentioned sanctions earlier. But even when thinking about military strikes, the range of attack options and the types of attacks and targets very much would depend on the ultimate policy goal. And to me, it's very unclear what Trump's goal actually is. He has mused about regime change. He's called for new leadership, but it's also clear that he does not want Iran to rebuild its nuclear facilities, its ballistic missile facilities. And I'll also note out in this context that Steve Witkoff, who's the president's special envoy, laid out demands when it came to kind of a deconfliction with Iran that were much broader than focused on repression of the repression of protesters by the regime, focused on giving up nuclear enrichment, cutting back on the missile program, and support for proxies. So again, I think going forward, it's going to be very dependent on what the actual kind of goal is, and how that will be kind of executed going forward.
Aziz, you wanted to come in on the
Yeah, I actually wanted to
scenarios?
expand upon some points Ali made, and I agree with him when he says, that the GCC or Gulf states will have are concerned and are going to be more concerned. And I just wanted to flesh that out a little bit more. I think, in my opinion, uh, the Gulf, I want to flesh out one scenario if Trump does strike, and then there's this retaliation back. Who may be struck, or what may be, or who may be the targets? And this is something I wish Mohammad and Ali could help me out with also. But I anticipate the following. I think Qatar won't be struck again. I don't think it will be struck again. I don't think Saudi Arabia will be struck because it's going to be something that's I think more, something more significant. Uh, if I was Bahrain or I was the UAE, I may be more concerned, in my opinion. And the reason being is because this is spilling into other dynamics that are taking place now in the region. Um, right now, from the Saudi perspective, uh, there is a there is some sort of uh, regional alignment between UAE and Israel in kind of this process of reordering the region. And they see this through, I think, the support of the formally of the STC and the cessationists in Somaliland. And so I think there is an issue here that maybe uh, Iran could probably strike um, some parts in the UAE or the American bases there, because there is now uh, a reputation in the region that the UAE has that's not very friendly to the UAE. So maybe it could get away with that. This is one point that I'm saying. The second thing is that I think also from the Saudi perspective, um, listen, Iran right now is the devil we do know, um, because what's after that is the devil we don't know. And this is also spills into the situation about this regional alignment. There is probably a fear that maybe there is a situation in the future where if there is some sort of regime collapse, a substitution, who will be next? And this may be some sort of an anti-Saudi, pro-Israel, UAE alignment. And I know it sounds very sensational and simplistic, but the reality is, I think these are some of the questions that are being asked, that maybe, uh, the future could be a situation where there is a regional dynamic that's incredibly not in Saudi Arabia's favor. So I think even if there is going to be an attack, they're going to reincorporate and double down on the diplomacy. We're going to see far more frequent diplomacy going to take place. Um, and those are just the two thoughts my 2 cents that I have.
Okay, thank you. Mohammed, I'm gonna I'll let you talk, but also I'll throw some of the questions to you that are in the chat. For example, there's a question, what can we say about the role of the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps now? And a question about regime change. In case of regime fall, what kind of regime change is conceivable in the foreseeable future? If you'd like to take any of these in addition to your comments, that would be much appreciated.
Sure. I think to build on what's been said, I think one variable that really needs to be understood in order to try to assess next possible steps is what kind of conflict Trump has appetite for. I think when he entered office, we had this conceptualization of him being opposed to forever wars and interpreting that as being opposed to foreign intervention. I think we are now learning that he's not opposed to foreign intervention, but he's opposed to dragged out intervention. So if he may abhor forever wars, he may welcome what I call ADD wars. Kind of, I want to go in a clear objective, in and out, clean. And I think some of the accounts of why Israel pushed back against an attack last week and instead may favor one now, as soon as tomorrow or the next 2 weekends, based on the information I've been seeing, is that they want to see something way more extensive, and that would target Iran's offensive capabilities, ability to maintain basically territorial integrity, things of that nature. So that's quite interesting. But I think the only thing Iran has to come up with in response to something like that is to get to the core of what Trump abhors the most, which is to drag out any conflict. And I think that's where the real clash is between Israel and the US. I think Israel is fine with something dragged out, whereas the US is not. And convincing Trump that you can go in and out is going to be difficult, but not impossible. And why do I say it's not impossible? Because I think humans are creatures of habit. Trump has had 2 instances in which he's carried out attacks on Iran since becoming president in 2017. One was the Soleimani attack in 2020, when he killed the commander of the Quds Force in Iraq, and Khamenei responded by attacking an empty US military base in Iraq. In 2025, Trump attacked Iranian nuclear facilities, and again, Iran responded with a one-off attack on an empty US military base in Qatar. So his lesson from those 2 instances is very clear. Iran will do a one-off, just like I do a one-off, and they're not going to cause any real damage. So if Iranian deterrence has been undermined by that, quite clearly, I think to most observers, clearly there must be some kind of discussion being held in Tehran right now that actually you're not being very strategic or a genius by doing a one-off in response to a one-off. That's not very clever of you to prevent war. In fact, you may actually invite even more attacks. Your strategy is not working. So in Tehran, I'm sure there are also people trying to convince Khamenei that if you want to actually stop further military confrontation, doing another performative one-off is not going to do it. And Trump's Achilles heel is dragging him into something extended. Now, they understand that the kind of damage that can do. And one of the interesting quotes is by the former head of the Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Force, the person in charge of the missile command. He was killed by Israel in June 2025. His name is Haji Zadeh. And there's a quote in which he states clearly, a confrontation with the United States would set us back 10 to 20 years. So this is the assessment of probably among the most hardline commanders within the IRGC. So they understand the costs. But are they willing to still absorb them, knowing that if they do nothing and repeat what's happened in the past, how can you expect a different result? I think these are the kind of factors, variables to do with Trump's behavior, Trump's kind of Achilles heel that we really need to think about. I think the kind of interpretation of this, how can I put it, aversion to a forever war doesn't mean he's opposed to military intervention. He's barely been in office 1 year. He's been in Venezuela, Somalia. He wants to do Cuba. He wants to do Colombia. He wants to do. He's done Iran. This is crazy, and it less the span of barely a year. So we need to think about how does foreign intervention look like. And again, just as a final point, if we try to distinguish what he's after and what Israel's after, I think Ali is right in the sense that the Israeli objective is they can live with state collapse in Iran, and I think they're content with that. As long as Iran's energy is directed inward, that's a win, right? And we've seen other countries turn inwards, but on their own accord. I think one of these major players which has really turned inwards, and what Aziz was alluding to, is Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia has turned way inward. And now the recent reactions you saw in Yemen is kind of a springing off effect of that. But this is is a different discussion. But they want to be focused on Vision 2030. This is the number one priority. And I think if they can get Iran in that direction at the end of a potential diplomatic process, that would be a huge win for the Trump administration. I'll leave things there.
Yeah, thank you. You've mentioned the position and the awareness of the IRGC. Do you want to say something perhaps also on the other question, the regime change? What kind of regime change, with or without U.S. Interference, in the foreseeable future would be theoretically conceivable?
The thing is that every time we've seen massive domestic unrest in Iran, such as in 2009 after the disputed presidential elections, or the 2025 attacks on Iran by Israel and the United States, is that there is some form of regime change, but just not the kind that's envisioned in the United States or in European capitals. What I mean by that is that you see the empowerment of, in fact, the more hardline voices. And I give you specific examples of this. For instance, the most harsh of the 17 security agencies. Iran has 17 intelligence agencies. The most probably hardline of all of them is the IRGC intelligence organization. If you look at its history, when did it come about? When was it actually given a real mandate and entered the scene and kind of challenged the intelligence ministry? It was in 2009 or the aftermath. That's number one. Or we look at after July 2025, after the Israeli attack, the person who suddenly months after was given high command, deputy chief of staff, is the interior minister of the former president of Iran, Raisi. So Vahidi, in fact, now among the most hardline voices opposed to any kind of accommodation with the United States. Somebody who flat out goes and says, we're going to crush protest, is somebody who was also former head of the Quds Force, who was in fact the predecessor of Soleimani. So there is a regime change ongoing, just not the type that's seen, I think, from the outside. And I would just end my remarks with, I think the ultimate observation from all of this is that I think everybody in Iran wants change. It's just about what type of change. Hardliners want to go to the past. Reformists may want to go to the future. And I would just end with a quote. I think the Italian movie, it's something to the tune of, you must now change everything for everything to remain the same. Right? This is the kind of conundrum that the Iranian political elite is stuck with right now.
Okay, thank you. We are almost nearing the end. I will give you all of you who want to, come in for some final remarks before we end. But I'll just throw in three keywords that we haven't even discussed for inspiration that you can pick up or not. We haven't addressed practically the nuclear file and what happens with that, how that interplays. Then over the last years, the term maximum pressure was so dominant when talking about US foreign policy. Has maximum pressure peaked, plateaued, or failed? And the third
worried about that. And one last point is that, of all the scenarios that you think about, continuity, like the supreme leader dies and there's another supreme leader, and, sort of the pattern that started with the 1979 revolution continues. I have a hard time imagining that would be the case. I also have a hard time imagining that Iran would transition to a Jeffersonian democracy. The infrastructure for it is just not on the ground. And there is no viable, organized, credible alternative who would be able to transition Iran into that kind of future. There's no Nelson Mandela in Iran. There's no even de Klerk in Iran. So the likeliest scenario, I believe, would be something of a regime transformation. And that might be transformation towards something that is more militant, maybe more pragmatic, or maybe more hardline. But certainly, I think the only force within Iran, despite the fact that it's not a monolith, but has what it is required to try to monopolize power in the aftermath of Khamenei's reign, is the Revolutionary Guards.
Grace?
Yeah, I'll just add some very quick thoughts. Firstly, I'll just note regarding to the potentiality of a new U.S. strike. I think it's important to note that the U.S. strikes that took place in June actually happened while mediation was going on between the US and Iran. And I think part of the lesson that was taken away from that is that the US cannot be trusted. And the second point that I think was taken away from that is the necessity, at least among some, of a nuclear weapon as a potential deterrence, which is something that was mentioned. Very quickly on regime change and the future of Iran, I think, Ali and others have commented on this very astutely, but I'll just note something that I thought was very interesting. There was an article that was written in Foreign Affairs in 1978 about the future of Iran and what a post-Shah regime would look like. And the author, who was an Iran expert, noted that the most likely regime to come into play, or a government structure would come into play, was a left-wing government structure. So I think when we think about the future of Iran, there's a huge amount of humility that we need to take on board, and that's true for any type of foreign intervention that might lead to the toppling of current regimes. It's often very unknown what comes after.
Mohammad, anything to add before we
I
conclude?
mean, there's tons to add, but I think the number one thing to consider is that I believe, despite the bombing of Iran's declared nuclear facilities, Iran remains a political decision away from a nuclear weapon. I believe Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, remains the primary obstacle to such a path. And I think in the medium term, looking in the next 3 to 5 years, I would frankly be astounded if Iran is not a nuclear power. And I think most likely path is that we will see some kind of military administration. Now, would a nuclear-armed military administration necessarily mean an all-out cataclysmic war between Iran and the United States or Israel at that time? Necessarily not. There are already, I think, experts out there who argue, in fact, that having a mutually assured destruction situation in the Middle East, or Iran being nuclear power, may bring stability. It will address some of the anxieties that exist right now, and it will bring some more confidence to allow, I wouldn't say normalization, but maybe even a cold peace between Iran and Israel. But this is way down the line. We're talking years down the line. If we can even say that there's an intact Iranian administration at that point, depending on what happens next few weeks and months. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you all. An hour is very short, so I'm afraid we'll have to conclude. So inside Iran, the repression may restore order, but as we learned from all of you, not necessarily stability, most likely not stability, and pressure from Washington creates leverage as well as problems. And whether or not this moment will turn into a genuine inflection point, or will simply be another, albeit very violent, phase of managed crisis, remains to be seen. And this is where we'll leave it. So let me just thank you to Mohammad. Unfortunately, we will have to close here, but I hope we'll have other opportunities to carry on. We have to leave it here. Thank you all to our speakers for this very clear-eyed discussion. I would also like to thank the GMF convening team for setting this all up. And last but not least, to all of you who joined us today online. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.